Hey y'all, this is Darren Van Dam, and you are watching Flick Connection, the show that connects you with the best movies to stream, and today we're talking about 20 incredible movies that HBO Max just recently added. So it's early August 2022, and HBO Max just added a bunch of fantastic movies. In fact, the first 10 on this list, or rather my bottom 10 on this list, are all lesser known movies you've likely never heard of, and then my top 10 on this list are among some of the best movies currently available on HBO Max. So we'll kick this list off with my number 20 pick, which is a little known movie from 2015 that has some big names in it, including Oscar Isaac, MOJAVE. Now this is actually written and directed by William Monahan, who's probably most famous for having written the screenplay for Scorsese's The Departed. And just like The Departed, MOJAVE's got some really intense scenes that are just pure dialogue. Oscar Isaac actually plays a homicidal drifter in this movie, and the bulk of the story here is really just a battle of wits between these two men, and it's fantastic stuff. It's an amazing performance by Isaac, and Garrett Hedlund is really the star of the movie. I'm really not sure why this guy's not more famous. I always enjoy him in movies, and this one's no exception. My number 19 pick is kind of a mashup. You've got a prison movie, a heist element. It's an all-around good crime movie, and it actually stars Ewan McGregor in an unusually wicked role. You don't see him playing bad guys too often. He does a great job here. I was not distracted by the fact that this is Ewan McGregor. I actually bought his performance as this hardened criminal. Just like MOJAVE, this movie actually features a battle of wits, or at least that's ultimately where it's headed. There's a gold heist. It all takes place in Australia, so it's got kind of a different flavor as far as prison movies go. All in all, this is an excellent pick, especially considering it's my number 19 pick. That's how strong this particular list is. Tom Hardy stars in my next pick in one of his most actionless movies, LOCKE. Now, I actually had the fortune of seeing this at a film festival, and if you've never been to a film festival, the crowds are always fantastic, and it really adds a lot to the enjoyment of the movie. However, when I saw LOCKE for the first time, I was expecting a very different movie than the one that I got, yet I was not disappointed. In this movie, you follow Tom Hardy's character, Ivan Locke. He is the only character on camera in the movie, and he spends the entire movie on the phone in his car. Now, as dull as that sounds, this ends up being an incredibly compelling story, and it's really brought to life by two facets. Tom Hardy's performance being really the main one, and then the filmmaking. They keep this thing threaded together, the camera cuts around, and it keeps you engaged in what's going on, considering the fact that there's no car chases, no major crimes happening. It's all fairly subtle stuff, and again, will keep you glued to your seat. In fact, I think you'll be astonished at how well this very simple premise will keep you on the edge of your seat. Legendary actor Christopher Plummer stars in my next pick, and it's an amazing performance from him in a relatively small, unknown movie titled Remember. Now, in this movie, he plays an elderly man with dementia who is essentially working on a kill list of people involved or related to the Nazi Party, people he believes are responsible for the death of his family in a concentration camp. Now, the problem is he's got very severe dementia, and he begins to question his actions. How accurate is it? Who's given him this information? Things like that. And it makes for an incredibly gripping story. It does have the look and feel of a smaller movie, but it's fairly well directed, and then of course you've got just an incredible performance from Christopher Plummer that really makes this movie work. If you're the least bit interested in that synopsis, this is a fantastic flick. Now, because HBO Max includes Turner Classic Movies, they've always got some fantastic classics available, and for my next pick, we're going to go back to 1955 with Mr. Roberts. This is one of my favorite Henry Fonda movies. It is fantastic. It's an incredible comedy starring him, but also James Cagney and a young Jack Lemmon. And it's a comedy about a bunch of guys on a supply ship towards the end of World War II, and they're essentially going stir crazy, and they're having to come up with all sorts of ways to entertain themselves. So there's no combat, no action in this movie, and that's kind of what it's about. These guys that are not involved in combat, sort of fighting their own war here on this boat with the captain. And there are some just fantastic scenes. My personal favorite is where they're trying to make fake whiskey on the boat. It's just fantastic, classic stuff. If you've never seen it, it is a total gem from 1955. Now, as fun and accessible as Mr. Roberts is, my next pick is one of the weirdest, darkest ones on this list, so it is not for everybody. So listen closely, but some of you, this is going to be your new favorite discovery. I'm talking about Enemy, starring Jake Gyllenhaal. Now, I say starring Jake Gyllenhaal, obviously he's the star, but the real star here is the director, Denis Villeneuve. He has gone on to do some amazing movies, including Prisoners, Arrival, Blade Runner 2049, and Dune. This is one of his smaller movies, but still, it's incredibly effective. Now, do not forget I told you how weird this movie is. If you don't like weird movies, this is not going to be the one for you. But Jake Gyllenhaal's character discovers a person, an actor in movies that looks exactly like him, down to every detail. And the story really just takes off from there and goes into a wild direction. This movie's got a wonderfully creepy look to it. The color palette, the cinematography, the score is bone-chilling. And this movie, in a lot of ways, reminded me of old Hitchcock movies, things like that, but done with quite a bit more flair than older movies like that. So, if any of that sounds like you, Enemy is going to be one of the top picks off your list. But again, do not watch this movie if you generally get repulsed by really bizarre movies. Oscar Isaac stars in my number 14 pick as well, along with Jessica Chastain in A Most Violent Year. Now, this is kind of a gangster movie, but also not quite. This movie takes place in 1981 in New York City, one of that city's most violent years, but Oscar Isaac plays an immigrant businessman who has come a little bit too closely tied to the mob in order to grow his business. So, while I say it's kind of a mob movie, you're really dealing with someone, a real person, a businessman who is in the orbit of organized crime. So, it does not have a lot of the beats that a typical gangster movie will have. However, it still does have some of that flavor. Jessica Chastain is fantastic in this movie as always, and Oscar Isaac as the lead really does carry this thing. Now, this is a fairly subtle movie and subtle story, but the look and feel of it is incredible. And this director has done some other great movies like All Is Lost with Robert Redford and Triple Frontier on Netflix. However, I do think A Most Violent Year is his best movie so far. My number 13 pick is another crime movie from Australia, but this time the legendary Guy Pearce takes us on a journey through a post-apocalyptic Australia. Now, the thing I really like about The Rover is the vision of this post-apocalyptic world is very different from what you normally see, and it feels much more real. This feels like the result of some sort of government collapse versus like an asteroid or aliens or zombies or anything like that. So right off the bat, it feels very real, very grounded. You also get an incredible but kind of odd performance from Robert Pattinson in this movie. This is one of his first big serious roles after Twilight, where he started to get noticed a little bit. This director did another Australian crime movie called Animal Kingdom, also stars Guy Pearce. I think that is a superior movie. That movie is excellent, but The Rover comes in kind of at a close second in terms of his filmography, and he's done some good movies, including The King on Netflix and War Machine, another Netflix movie starring Brad Pitt. But The Rover and Animal Kingdom are both exceptional picks from his filmography. Okay, my next pick comes from 1958, and it is a sci-fi horror movie that was actually remade in the 80s and is considered one of the greatest remakes of all time, The Fly. Now, while the 80s remake with Jeff Goldblum is one of the best and most successful remakes ever made, the original The Fly is a fantastic movie from 1958. It's got some great effects, the story comes through on this incredibly well. The 80s version is much darker and more grim and certainly not family friendly. And while the themes and some of the things that happen in the 1958 version, like murder, are not family friendly, it's shot in a way where it is pretty accessible for general audiences. And if you don't know the story, it's about a scientist creating a teleportation machine when a fly unexpectedly joins him into the chamber, and he then becomes half man, half fly. And what's cool about this is because it's a horror movie from 1958, it's got a lot of things that have just become classic tropes in horror movies, things that might seem silly or cheesy. However, The Fly is done with pretty incredible production value for the time, so you get kind of both. You get this cheesy drive-in sci-fi flick that has this excellent production value and is a real joy to watch. All right, now we're going to close out my bottom 10 on this list, the bottom 10, with a fantastic movie from Jim Jarmusch, a legendary director responsible for movies like Broken Flowers, Only Lovers Left Alive, Coffee and Cigarettes, and Dead Man, starring Johnny Depp. But Ghost Dog, Way of the Samurai, stars Forest Whitaker in a really phenomenal movie. Now in Ghost Dog, Forest Whitaker plays a hitman for the mob who embraces the way of the samurai. Really just meaning philosophically, that's how he approaches killing people and just his day-to-day life. Then he becomes targeted by the mob, which is what appears to happen almost every time someone decides to become a hitman for the mob, at least in movies. So again, this one's kind of a mob movie, but it's got that Jim Jarmusch flavor. Obviously some really great dialogue, but also some interesting scenes that are just unlike anything you're gonna see in any other gangster movies. This does have a unique flavor because of Jarmusch. If you've been a fan of any of his other movies, I do consider this one to be one of his best and most underrated movies. But even if you've not really discovered his movies, you're not familiar with some of the other ones I've talked about, this one could be a good way to break into his work. As I said, this is a weird movie, but it's not weird in an off-putting way. I just mean it's got an unusual flavor that I happen to love. Now, before moving on to the top 10 on this list, real quick, I just want to tell you, if you want more movie recommendations, go check out DarrenVanDam.com. I put movie recommendations right there on the homepage, as well as access to back catalog videos, and that's it. You'll literally never run out of good movies to watch, so again, go check out DarrenVanDam.com. There's a link in the description as soon as this video is over. But, speaking of the video, let's go ahead and talk about the top 10 on this list, starting with my number 10 pick, Stardust. Now this movie is most closely related to the classic The Princess Bride. If you're a big fan of The Princess Bride and you've somehow never seen Stardust, this is going to be one of your new favorite movies, trust me. This is actually based on a novel by Neil Gaiman, whose new series The Sandman is coming to Netflix days after I post this video. Not only that, but it's directed by Matthew Vaughn, whose filmography includes Layer Cake, The Kingsman, X-Men First Class, and Kick-Ass. So he's done some fantastic movies, and a couple of turds if I'm going to be honest, but for the most part he does some killer flicks. And Stardust really does stand out. This makes a great date night movie, but also potentially a family-friendly movie if your kids are a little bit older. This one is rated PG-13, but it's got some wonderful fantasy elements, and more importantly, the story never gets lost in all of the visual spectacle on display. I mean, there's some fantastic effects in this movie, yet the story really does shine through. So just an all-around really great pick, and keep in mind we're only at number 10. This list is insane. My number 9 pick is one of the best action movies to have been made so far this century, The Raid Redemption. Now, The Raid 2 I consider to be one of, if not the best action movie created this century so far. At least it's like in the top 3. It's really up there. It too is included with HBO Max, but it's been available there for quite a while now. They just added The Raid Redemption, which is the first part. Now, these movies can be enjoyed independently from each other, but why not watch them together? They're both fantastic. The Raid Redemption actually follows the same plot line as the movie Dread, yet these movies came out right about the same time. At the time that it was released, The Raid featured some of the most brutal martial arts action ever put to film, only to be outdone by The Raid 2. Honestly, I cannot express to you how amazing The Raid 2 is. It is this gangster movie filled with really raw martial arts action that just does not quit. However, The Raid was the lead up to that, and it too has got some incredible action that just goes over the top in the best way possible. It just pushes the envelope to the bit where it's incredibly intense, but still very, very entertaining. I mean, honestly, if you consider yourself an action movie fan, especially if you consider yourself an action movie aficionado, you have to see these two movies. If you haven't done it, make them the first ones you watch off of this list. My next pick is from another legendary director. It's David Lynch's Blue Velvet. Now, David Lynch is known for directing some really weird movies. In fact, his filmography includes some of the weirdest yet most successful movies ever made. However, Blue Velvet is maybe his least strange movie. There's plenty of strange things going on in this movie, things that don't quite feel right, they feel unnatural, but it's all done to heighten this bizarre mood that David Lynch is so famous for. And it's present here in this movie, yet it feels like you're interacting with potentially real people, which is not the case with most David Lynch movies. So that said, if you have not really discovered David Lynch, Blue Velvet would be a fantastic place to start. I would also maybe recommend Twin Peaks is another good place to start, but if you enjoy Blue Velvet, then there's a chance you could go down the David Lynch rabbit hole. If not, if this movie turns you off, there is little to no chance you're gonna like anything else David Lynch has created. My next pick is an underrated action sci-fi movie from 2011 starring Jake Gyllenhaal and Michelle Monaghan called Source Code. Now, this was actually directed by Duncan Jones, who also did the movie Moon with Sam Rockwell. And while Source Code has some similar mind-bending elements to it, it is filled with more action than Moon was. And I gotta say, for a PG-13 action movie, this one definitely punches above its weight, which is why it gets this spot on the list. It's got plenty of twists and turns, and not only are they twists that will surprise you, but they're really interesting too, and they're unlike anything I've seen in just about any other movie. In fact, the less you know about Source Code, the better, because it starts from a place of confusion and then builds from there. So it really is best, if you've never seen it or you don't remember what this movie is about, it's best to start this one with little to no information. However, if you generally like sci-fi movies with twists and turns, Christopher Nolan-esque kind of stuff, then Source Code is going to be the pick for you off of this list. My number 6 pick on this list is also a sci-fi movie, but this one is in the weird territory and not for everybody. However, if you really enjoy the filmmaking process, then Under the Skin is a must-watch movie, whether you like it or not. In this movie, Scarlett Johansson plays an alien disguised as a human who goes out and seduces or picks up men and brings them back to her lair. What's interesting about Under the Skin is that portions of this were filmed in reality. I mean, they actually put Scarlett Johansson in a van with hidden cameras, and she went out and picked up random men to try to convince them to get in the car. So what you're seeing on camera is 100% authentic. In fact, they even got some of the men who were randomly picked up to sign waivers and come and take part in some other scenes to help everything get glued together. But this is from director Jonathan Glazer, who has only done 2 other movies: Sexy Beast with Ray Winston and Birth with Nicole Kidman. While I am a little partial to Sexy Beast, it's one of my favorite hidden gem movies to recommend. Under the Skin is on another level. This is Stanley Kubrick territory. I mean, the movie itself doesn't quite feel like Kubrick's style, but the thought that goes into this movie and all the little details really reminded me a lot of Stanley Kubrick's work. So if you're a fan of that, you gotta check this movie out. Okay, my number 5 pick got a ton of notoriety during Oscar season. I mean, it was nominated for an Oscar for Best Picture and Best Adapted Screenplay, and it won for Best Supporting Actor, Best Editing, and Best Sound Mixing in Whiplash. J.K. Simmons won an Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor, and for good reason. It's an incredible performance in this movie, and this movie kind of broke Miles Teller out. He was already gaining some notoriety, but this movie really put him on the map. But above all that cool stuff, this movie is incredibly well written and directed. And as good as all the elements are, I mean, I would have loved this movie no matter what. But the climax of this movie is one of the greatest, I think, in movie history. I'm not saying it's like top 3 or anything psychotic like that, but it's up there. I mean, not only is it effective at really drawing out a bevy of emotions, but it's also structured. The climax is very different from what you normally see, and I absolutely loved it for that. I was blown away at the end of this movie, and not because of some major twist or mind-blowing thing. I was blown away at just how, again, effective Whiplash was. Speaking of movies that are effective, my next pick is another sci-fi movie, and it's one of the best in its genre, at least out of movies made in the last 10 years or so. Ex Machina is from writer-director Alex Garland, and it is, I believe, the first feature film he ever directed. He's also known for having written things like 28 Days Later, Sunshine. He even wrote the screenplay for Dread, which I mentioned when I talked about The Raid Redemption, but Ex Machina is among some of his best work. This also stars Oscar Isaac again. I guess he's the winner for getting featured the most in this particular video. But Alicia Vikander actually plays this AI robot who is essentially trying to convince someone that she's real or close to being real, has real thoughts, and is not just programmed and trying to outsmart a person. It's an interesting concept. I mean, there is a thing called the Turing test where an AI system, even if it's just a computer, will try to communicate with a person to see if it can trick them into believing that they're a real person and not a computer. It's an interesting concept, and this movie delivers that concept in a fantastic way. Cinematography, everything like that's great, but the movie's also filled with these fantastic moments that make it well worth rewatching. So if you have seen it, I can guarantee this is going to be worth revisiting because there's a lot of stuff that you probably missed on the first go round. And if you've never seen it, this is easily one of the best sci-fi movies on HBO Max or really any streaming service right now. My number 3 pick comes from another legendary director, Guillermo del Toro, and it happens to be one of my favorite movies of his, but it's also one of his first feature films, The Devil's Backbone. He directed a movie called Kronos and an American movie called Mimic right before this, and I think The Devil's Backbone is easily among some of his best work. In fact, he would revisit similar territory in his career multiple times with movies like Pan's Labyrinth and Crimson Peak, but The Devil's Backbone is a classic style horror movie. It's about a young boy who gets left at this really ominous orphanage that he believes is haunted and is holding some really dark secrets. So again, a structure similar to Pan's Labyrinth and Crimson Peak, yet this one's got some subtlety and some not so subtle things that I think work a lot better. It's a bit of a slow build, you gotta get into the characters, and it is Spanish language, so you will have to read subtitles on HBO Max for this one. However, it's well worth it. If you've been a fan of any of his work in any kind of way, shape, or form, The Devil's Backbone is gonna be a must-watch for you. My number 2 pick is largely considered one of the greatest escape movies ever put to film, The Great Escape. If you've never seen The Great Escape, it features an incredible cast, head off by Steve McQueen. You might even remember that they featured part of this movie in Quentin Tarantino's Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. And it's because this is such a legendary movie with a legendary actor and a legendary role, and Charles Bronson is even in this movie, along with just a ton of fantastic actors. They're all in this Nazi prison camp and they're trying to escape. Repeated escape attempts, and this ends up being one of the best, if not the best, prison escape movies of all time. I mean, the tunneling sequences are all entertaining, the movie's funny when it needs a little bit of a break, it's serious when it needs to be serious, yet you could watch this one with the family. I mean, it is 3 hours long, it is a war epic of sorts, but it also features some fantastic motorcycle stunts, and again, one of the greatest prison escapes in movie history. And that brings us to my number 1 pick, which might just be the greatest horror movie ever made. It is one of only a couple of horror movies ever nominated for Best Picture. It was also nominated for Best Actress, Best Actor, Best Supporting Actress, Best Director, Best Cinematography, Best Set Direction, Best Film Editing, and won an Academy Award for Best Screenplay and Best Sound. I'm talking about William Friedkin's The Exorcist. Now, speaking of the sound, I have watched this movie in a dark room with a good set of headphones on. I'm telling you, it really is the way to watch The Exorcist. No matter how many times you've seen it before, it will be a different viewing experience. And while this movie is known for some of its more brash sequences, and those are well directed, the rest of the movie has this incredible direction and pace to it. Every single scene is sharp. There's very little fat on this movie for a horror movie, and it's incredibly effective at taking you on this journey, injecting you with fear. If somehow you've yet to see The Exorcist, you're maybe one of my younger viewers, prepare yourself for this one, watch it with some attention. Don't just put it on and play with your phone, because it's not gonna really get into your bones the way that it could and should. That's why it's one of the greatest horror movies ever made. But that is the list. I hope you enjoyed it. Don't forget to go check out DarrenVanDam.com when you're done with this list, but I will keep making these videos as long as you keep watching them. Thanks for checking out this special HBO Max episode, and you will see me on the next one.